We are with Professor Avram Ehrlich, learning about Exodus. You know, it's very interesting what you were saying, that it has a military tone. I'm reading here in Hebrew, it really sounds to me as the Supreme Commander is commanding, and it really has a military tone to it.
Well, the text combines many different types of commands, many different types of laws, and when one is looking at it from a strictly religious perspective, one does not fully appreciate that this is the entire spectrum of law and legislation and different types of military conquest and coding and relationships, and indeed the language here is a language of orders, but there are also orders, there are commands, there are statutes, there are temporary injunctions. There are many different subtle relationship structures in very basic language.
What's this whole show here with the animals, scary animals, like crocodiles? And
the crocodile was created in the Genesis story on the 5th or 6th days with the fish. They are the greatest creatures, the oldest and the most ancient creatures, and there are many different species, and one being introduced to the Nile. Well, I can imagine, and I think that it's really for biological scientists to understand what was happening here. If a new species was being introduced to the Nile, was it killing other species? Were they hungry? Were they breeding crocodiles, or because that's what Noah did. He bred animals, and the angels or the master craftsmen would be breeding. They would be the whole basis of the preservation of knowledge, of ancient knowledge, was in the breeding on the species. So to breed these great crocodiles, basically what they were doing is saying, sir, we have access to your breeding grounds, to your great crocodiles, to basically your treasures of creation. And all that we've domesticated, all that we've been able to plant in them viruses or plagues, or that they were starved and that they killed the fish, or created the illusion with a few dead carcasses. They created the illusion of blood, which they did it in several places, and then miscommunicated within the system that there was that the Nile, that the rivers have gone red. They had reports from several places. All it would require was a few crocodiles and a few carcasses in several rivers and pools of water for that illusion to be pulled off. But then, in return, it seems that the magicians reproduced that. But if they reproduced it in the true biological way, where they wanted to show that they too can kill massive amounts of animals or creatures in the Nile, they could have unleashed a virus. And so, to your question.
So why the 10 plagues?
The 10 plagues, I think, is a little bit of, not humour, but it's very unusual that there should be 10, which is a symmetric, which is a number, which is a very special number, 10, which later comes to play further in the camp. The structure, the social structure is organised by 10. But here, the 10 plagues, they're quite random. One is boils, the other one is infections, the other one is perhaps a virus, the other one is pestilence. They are varied. Are we talking about one are we talking about spiders, or we're talking about mosquitoes, or we're talking about flies, or we're talking about a whole combination of them? That they are mentioned as 10 seems to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek. There are not really 10. What there is a chain of consequences. One thing led to another thing, led to another thing, led to another thing. And what those chains were, I won't be able to answer. But I think that by students of biology, or students of viruses, of bacteria, or of the rivers, or of river diseases, or of plagues, should be able to say what triggers them. What I am saying is that Moses had access to the archives of Joseph, and that is in the story. That is implied in the basis of the story, because Moses finds Joseph's body and brings him out, and so he had access to his tomb. And in the tomb is the history of the famine, and how Joseph dealt with the famine, and how Joseph and the methods for future storage, and the methods for future preservation of food, because when food is preserved, there's a whole biodiversity, and there's introductions of one creature to fight with another creature to keep off pestilence, and these were very well known balances of the biosphere of food, and the preservation of food, and that was very known because Joseph set up the storehouses for the entire empire, and possibly the witches and the magicians and the wise ones were components of the priesthood, which Joseph was very much part of, and which Moses was very much part of. So that they were dealing with structures that they were fully aware of, and this seems to become even more poignant when we're dealing with the name of God, and even more poignant when it the 10 plagues counter contrast with the 10 commandments, and which also, of many commandments, it doesn't really seem that there should be 10, and some of the commandments could be different, or they could be added. In fact, there are 2 versions of the 10 commandments, and in the versions they're not exactly the same commandments, and in fact there are many more than 10. So it also seems to be a little bit random, but 10 eventually does become a very important number in the structure of the social structure of the camps of Israel.
So, are there miracles?
The miracles is that we're living and that we're breathing, and all life is a miracle. These miracles, the miracle as is in the ability of the imagination to conceive and devise and structure and plan and interact with the diverse bodies and people and resources, and to bring everything together in time and chronology and synchronicity and in order and in timeliness. These things are miracles. These things happen mainly through military maneuvers. We see a lot of people talk about miracles and military maneuvers because there's a lot of incentivized, choreographed movement where people have to work together because their lives depend on it. And when these things happen, wonderful things can occur. So to your question.
So what are then signs and what are the wonders? What's the difference between them?
They are all codes. They're communications. This is a subtext for a code of war and a code of strategy. Like the Tao Te Ching, it is the art of war, and there's a lot of subtext here, and this text as the book of Joshua can be used and has been used for military purposes. If one presumes that there is communication here between different factors, if one presumes that there is, if words are just being developed, and signals are communicated over long distances, then Moses is containing in his hand great advantages, and he seems that if he was able to get knowledge of an invading army, or an invading pestilence, or of locusts, or of an earthquake, or of volcanic ash, or of larvae coming from one place to the other, if the benefit of some pre-knowledge of something, if it were properly deployed, is an incredible psychological advantage. These 10 plagues didn't necessarily occur over a number of days. They seem to have occurred over several years. There may have been one pestilence, but the one of the plagues that does not make sense within the context was the of hail, where it was hail. That seemed to be at a different time. But if one knows, and some are saying that the hail could have been caused because of volcanoes in Malta or in distant places, which would have caused these types of occurrences. So if one knows in advance that these things are happening through a trade route or a communication route over the ancient Near East, and that is deployed for psychological warfare, or in order to gain the advantage over a divided court of Egypt, or to gain some influence amongst the magicians, or to gain the illusions that could be played, which would appear to be 10 plagues. There's a lot of maneuver. So when you ask me, what are the wonders and what are the signs? These are the basis of early code and communication. If you ask, are there miracles? I will say it's a miracle to believe, but to breathe. But these are no miracles. This is strategy.
We see some military coordinates in the text.
All language is military. Language was first deployed, the alphabet was first deployed as a military code. It would not have gathered muster or critical mass amongst people to read a good novel 3,000 years ago. It was used to communicate between armies and to make sure that people had enough flour and goods to cook, and in fact the different languages were very good with different types of things. There was a language for storage, and there was a language for animal and dealing with animals. There's a language for numbers. But a language for law and the development of social structures over. Well, there's a very nuanced. And and the alphabetical system, it was a matter of the right time or the right place. But it does take place in this region, and it does seem that Moses has discovered it.
I'm just reading in the scripture here in the background. It says, "My army," the people of Israel, God's army.
It was a military operation from the start. Everything about it is military, perhaps except for the story, which it seems to take on a religious or a miraculous tone. But that could be the nuance of language, or because later generations, well, there was no real easy way to explain what was happening, so later generations presumed a naive layer over it of miraculousness, but this is a military operation. The children of Israel here are described going out in armies. There was a weaponization of a class of engineers or craftsmen, which Moses seemed to have developed a relationship with. They had influence over the trade routes and over the over instrumentation and over communication, and it seemed they were able to intercept the messages of the Pharaoh and have access to the court of the Pharaoh and into the zoos of the Pharaoh and into the biological, into the storage rooms, into the biological weapons centers of the Pharaoh, and so yes, it was an army maneuver from the start and until the entry into Canaan.
So this whole warfare is happening, and Moses and Aaron are at the age of 80?
Well, later on in the desert, it describes Moses holding on to this staff, and he was nearly 120, and he was guiding the war, and he was making the signals, and the story of Moses gets more and more bizarre. This is only the very beginning, and that's why it's really probably very important to understand right now what was happening, because by the end, Moses has almost like a cult-like figure, and there may be different stories or different commentaries of who Moses was, which were later on combined into the book, because he got very, very unusual. He was wearing a mask, he had a whole ritual around him to protect him and to protect access to him, and so it really is important to understand what his early influences were. But it is somewhat humorous that Moses is old and he's taking on this entire empire and leading an exodus, and he's doing it through words, and he's doing it through planning, and he's doing it through signs, and it really does show the contrast that is being developed here, because in addition to that it is all happening through words and signs, there is also the tabernacle, which contrasts with the pyramids of Egypt, one which is forever, tens of thousands of years, with huge stones hewn, with tens of thousands of people having to build it, and with great architecture, and connected to the positions of the solar positions and the sun and the stars. And the other one is the box, the tabernacle, which is entirely mobile. And whilst the Pharaoh is buried in the pyramid, in the box is a law, the 10 words, the 10 commandments. And they were carried, and they were completely nomadic, and they were carried together with boxes of instruments and tools, and which were the cutting edge of knowledge and technology, but also of great allowing for great diversity and great mobility. So these are in contrast, and all of this is dependent on the word and the signs and the judgments which Moses is wielding. You know, it's not really a book about the children of Israel. It really is a book about the children of Levi and what happens to the Levite nation. And what seems to have happened was that book about the Levites was later on adopted by the whole of Israel as their own story. But really it's the story of the nomadic group of people cursed to nomadism because of their violence, who become a disciplined, organized, strategic people of law and of instrumentation and of nomadic instrumentation, and they go and they preserve the covenant and the basic ideas, the axes of their of their thinking and all their instruments and their tools, and they share it with the entire in the entire nation via the temple, and also because they're spread out, and the Levites are musicians and craftsmen, and were not allowed to have land, so that their inheritance was God, and that they would also belong to the people. So this is a very interesting story of the Levites, and also but a universal story.